My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 34 years old. 6 days after my surgery, I stood in my own kitchen, gripping the counter because my incisions still pulled with every breath, and I watched my older brother move a grocery bag out of my reach. "Go. Easy on that," Derek said, not even looking at me. "I didn't put a penny into this house, but I still know how things should run here. You need to know your place, Naomi." I had paid for that bag. I had paid for the mortgage under it, the roof, over it, and the lights that let him see well enough to say those words to my face. I said nothing. I just breathed through the pain and looked at him the way you look at someone you are seeing clearly for the first time. He didn't know that 3 days earlier, before I ever went under anesthesia, I had already mailed something that would take his signature apart page by page, in front of people he could not afford to lose. Before I tell you what happened next and why he ended up with nothing but a moving box and an empty room, tell me what time it is where you're watching from and where in the world you're tuning in tonight. I grew up the fixer in my family. That's the role you get assigned when you're the quiet one and your brother is the loud one. Derek is 3 years older than me, and from the time I could remember anything, the rule in our house was unspoken but absolute. Derek's comfort came first, and my job was to make sure nothing disturbed it. When we were kids, our mother used to serve dinner in a very specific order. Derek's plate first, filled generously. Mine second, smaller, because I was the girl who didn't eat that much anyway. Even on nights I'd tell her I was still hungry. I remember being 8 years old, sitting at that table, watching him get seconds while I was told to wait until everyone else was done in case there wasn't enough. There was always enough. That was never really about food. I remember another dinner, this one when I was 10. My mother had made a pot roast, the good kind she only made for company or birthdays, and it happened to be nobody's birthday that night. Derek had brought home a mediocre report card, 3 C's and a D, and instead of the lecture I expected, he got the good pot roast and an extra hour of television. I had brought home a report card with 2 A's and a B that same week. Nobody mentioned it. I asked my mother once quietly why Derek got rewarded for doing worse than me. She told me that Derek struggled more and needed the encouragement, and that I was naturally fine and didn't need the same kind of support. I understood even at 10 that being fine meant being invisible, and being invisible meant going without. There was a specific afternoon when I was 14 that I still think about sometimes. I had saved for 4 months doing odd chores for neighbors to buy a bicycle I'd wanted, a blue one with a basket, from a classmate who was moving away. Derek borrowed it 2 days after I got it, without asking, and returned it with a bent front wheel and a scraped frame. When I cried about it, my father told me not to make a big deal out of it, that it was just a bike, and that Derek didn't mean anything by it. Derek never apologized. He never offered to fix it. I fixed it myself with a wrench I bought with the last of my chore money, and I rode it anyway, dented and all, because I refused to let it sit unused just because someone else had broken it, and walked away. When I was 12, Derek broke a neighbor's window with a baseball. He blamed me, said I threw it, and he was just standing nearby. I hadn't touched the bat that day. My mother believed him anyway because believing me would have meant admitting her golden child could lie to her face. I took the grounding. I took the disappointment in her eyes. I learned that keeping the peace meant swallowing the truth and letting someone else wear it. By the time I was in my 20s, the pattern had a name I didn't say out loud yet, but I lived it constantly. Derek borrowed money and never paid it back. Derek missed family events and got excused because he was busy building something. I missed one dinner for a work deadline once and got a lecture about family loyalty that lasted 40 minutes. When our father passed, 6 years ago, he left the house to both of us jointly with a simple note in his will asking that we take care of each other. I took that seriously. Derek took it as an invitation. He moved in within 2 months, said it was temporary, said he was between jobs and just needed to get back on his feet. I paid off the small remaining balance on the mortgage using money from my father's life insurance, money that was meant for both of us because Derek said he'd rather keep his half liquid. For opportunities, I never saw those opportunities. I saw a man who slept until noon most days and called it networking. For 6 years, I paid the property taxes. I paid the insurance. I paid for every repair, every utility bill, every grocery run for a house that legally belonged to both of us, but functioned, financially, as mine alone. Derek contributed exactly one thing consistently: opinions about how I should be running things. I kept my mouth shut through most of it because that had always been the rule. Keep the peace. Don't make waves, don't be the difficult one. I told myself it was temporary, that he'd get back on his feet eventually, that family helps family and I shouldn't keep score. The moment that changed things wasn't loud. It was small, and it happened almost a year before my surgery, but I didn't act on it fully until everything came to a head in that kitchen. It was a Tuesday evening. I came home from work exhausted, and I found Derek at the kitchen table with paperwork spread out in front of him. When I asked what it was, he folded it quickly and said it was nothing, just some bank stuff for a loan he was considering. I didn't push. I trusted him. That word matters here, because trust is exactly what he was counting on. A few weeks later, I got a notification from my bank about a credit inquiry I hadn't authorized. When I called to ask about it, the representative mentioned an application that had listed our house as collateral, with my name attached as a co-signer. I hadn't signed anything. I told them so, calmly, and asked them to flag the account and send me everything in writing. That night, I didn't confront him. I sat with it. I let the anger settle into something colder and more useful than a shouting match would have been. I decided, right there at that kitchen table with a printed email in front of me, that I was done keeping the peace at my own expense. Not with rage, with a plan. I want to be clear about something because it matters for everything that follows. I didn't want to destroy my brother. I wanted the truth to exist somewhere undeniable, in ink and dates and signatures, so that no one, including him, could rewrite what had actually happened. That is the difference between revenge and evidence. Revenge wants someone to suffer. Evidence just wants the truth to be impossible to deny. So I started collecting. I requested certified copies of every bank statement going back 3 years, both the joint utility accounts and my personal accounts, showing every mortgage payment, every insurance premium, every repair invoice, all under my name, all paid from my income. I organized them by month in a spreadsheet, with dates that lined up neatly against Derek's employment gaps, which I could piece together from old text messages where he'd mentioned being in between things for months at a time. I saved texts. Not out of spite, but because a text message is a timestamp you can't argue with later. I had one from 8 months earlier where he wrote, word for word close enough that I'll paraphrase carefully, he told me he wasn't going to pay toward the house because it wasn't fair to expect him to fund something he considered mine anyway, even though his name was on the deed. I screenshotted it, backed it up in 2 places, and printed a copy. I went further than texts. I pulled the property tax records from the county office, which are public documents, and requested certified copies showing my name as the sole payer for the last 5 consecutive filing years. I requested a copy of the homeowner's insurance policy directly from the provider, which listed me as the only party who had ever made a payment or filed a claim, including one small claim after a storm damaged part of the roof, a repair I paid for entirely out of pocket, while Derek was, according to his own social media from that same week, on a weekend trip he told me he couldn't afford to help with groceries that month. I also kept a folder of home maintenance receipts going back 3 years for a new water heater, a furnace repair, gutter cleaning, and a plumbing emergency that had cost almost $2,000 on its own. Every invoice had my name on it, my card number on the payment record, and a date. I laid them out next to Derek's bank statements, which my attorney later obtained through the discovery process once the case was formally opened, and they showed a pattern that spoke for itself. Deposits from part-time gig work, withdrawals for personal subscriptions, dining out, and clothing purchases, but never once a transfer, a check, or a cash deposit toward the mortgage, the taxes, or a single shared bill. I want to mention one more piece of evidence, because it turned out to matter more than I expected. 6 months before the surgery, I had installed a small doorbell camera, mostly for package theft concerns in our neighborhood, not for anything related to Derek. That camera happened to capture him accepting a courier delivery of banking documents on a Tuesday afternoon, signing for them under my name, a detail that later corroborated the bank's own findings about how the fraudulent application had been initiated using intercepted mail. I hadn't planned for that footage to matter. It simply existed, quietly, doing its job, the same way all the other documentation had been doing its job long before I decided to use any of it. I contacted the bank, in writing about the unauthorized loan inquiry, and asked for their fraud department to open a formal case. They confirmed in an official letter that an application had been submitted using my personal information without my consent, and that the signature on the co-signer line did not match any signature they had on file for me. That letter alone changed everything because it meant this was no longer a family disagreement. It was a documented attempt at fraud. I met with an attorney, a woman named Patricia Reyes, who specialized in property and family estate disputes. I brought everything: the spreadsheet, the texts, the fraud letter from the bank, copies of the will, and copies of every payment I'd made on the house for 6 years. She looked through it for almost 40 minutes without saying much, then looked up at me and said that what I had wasn't a family argument. It was a paper trail that told its own story without me needing to raise my voice once. Patricia asked me a question that I still think about. She asked whether I wanted this resolved quietly, in a way that gave Derek an easy path to walk away with dignity, or whether I wanted the full weight of documentation on the table from day one. I told her I didn't want to humiliate him. I wanted the truth recorded somewhere he couldn't later rewrite, and I wanted the financial reality of the last 6 years reflected honestly in whatever came next. She nodded and said that was, in her experience, the difference between clients who regretted their approach later and clients who didn't. She helped me draft a formal notice, sent through certified mail, informing Derek that due to the fraudulent loan application using the property as collateral, and given the joint ownership structure, I was initiating a legal process to either buy out his share of the house at fair market value or pursue a partition action through the courts, which would force a sale and split the proceeds according to legal ownership, minus what he owed me in back-owed shared expenses, which the spreadsheet now proved down to the dollar. Patricia also advised me on something I hadn't considered: notifying the bank in writing that I wanted the fraud case formally documented as part of any future legal proceeding, rather than resolved informally as a customer service matter. That single request meant the bank's findings would exist as an official record, citable in court, rather than a private note buried in an internal file somewhere. It took an extra 2 weeks to process, but it meant that by the time the partition filing was ready, I had a certified letter from the bank stating plainly that the signature on the cosigner line did not match any signature on file for me, and that the application had been flagged and denied before any funds were disbursed. While that letter was in transit, I scheduled my surgery. It had been planned for months, unrelated to any of this, a procedure I needed, and had been putting off because I didn't want to be vulnerable in a house where I already felt like a guest. But I went ahead with it, because I refused to let his behavior keep controlling my medical decisions any longer. That is the moment you saw in the opening. 6 days after surgery, still healing, standing in my own kitchen, and Derek telling me to go easy on groceries I had paid for, warning me to know my place in a house I had been the only one financially holding together for 6 years. He said those words without knowing that the certified letter had already been delivered to his office 2 days earlier. He said them without knowing that his manager, at the financial services firm where he worked, had already received a copy of the bank's fraud notice, because part of due diligence at his firm required disclosure of any active fraud investigations tied to an employee's name, and my attorney had made sure that requirement was triggered through the proper compliance channel. I didn't yell at him in that kitchen. I didn't even argue. I looked at him, still sore, still healing, and I said, calmly, that I hoped he was ready for Thursday. He asked what was happening Thursday. I told him he'd know soon enough. What happened next unfolded exactly the way calm, documented action tends to unfold. Slowly, then all at once. The certified letter arrived at his office on a Monday. He didn't mention anything to me about it that week, which told me he was hoping it would somehow resolve itself quietly, the way our childhood conflicts always had, with me absorbing the discomfort so he wouldn't have to. On Wednesday, his company's compliance department reached out to him directly because the bank's fraud department, in following its own protocol, had flagged the loan application as tied to potential identity misuse, and financial firms take those things seriously when the applicant is one of their own employees handling client accounts. Derek worked in a role that required a clean compliance record. An open fraud investigation using a family member's identity was not a footnote. It was a direct conflict with the terms of his employment. I later learned, through the documents that surfaced during the partition case, that Derek's compliance officer had scheduled an internal review meeting for the following Monday, asking him to bring any documentation clarifying the nature of the loan application and his relationship to the cosigner named on it. He apparently told his manager it was a misunderstanding between siblings that would be resolved quietly within days. His manager reportedly responded that identity-related fraud flags could not be closed on the basis of a verbal family assurance, and that the matter would remain open until an official resolution, whether through bank clearance or court record, was provided. That single meeting, scheduled and documented in his employee file, became part of the reason his position was later reviewed independently of the settlement itself. On Thursday, the family found out, but not because I told them. Derek called our Aunt Linda in a panic, trying to get ahead of the story before it reached anyone else. He told her a version where I was trying to steal the house and blowing a misunderstanding out of proportion. Linda, to her credit, asked him a very simple question: had he or had he not submitted a loan application listing Naomi as a co-signer without her knowledge? Derek didn't answer directly. He changed the subject to how ungrateful I'd always been. Linda called me that evening. I didn't defend myself with emotion. I told her I could send her the documents if she wanted to see them for herself, because I wasn't interested in a war of stories, only in what could actually be verified. She said yes. I sent her the bank's fraud letter, the spreadsheet of 6 years of payments, and the screenshot of his own message admitting he wouldn't contribute toward the house. Linda forwarded that, without me asking her to a small family group chat that included 2 cousins, our uncle, and Derek's own girlfriend at the time, Priya, who I later learned had been under the impression that Derek was the one paying half the household expenses, this entire time based on things he had told her. The messages in that chat came in slowly at first. Our cousin Marcus wrote that he didn't want to get in the middle of it, and then, 10 minutes later, asked if the fraud letter attached was really from the bank directly because it looked official. Our Uncle Ray, who almost never commented on family disputes, sent a single line asking Derek to explain, in his own words, why my name would appear on a loan application he hadn't discussed with me. Derek's response was to post a paragraph about how families shouldn't air disputes over group chat and how he was disappointed that certain people were trying to embarrass him. He didn't answer Ray's question. Everyone noticed that he didn't answer it. Priya was the one who asked the sharpest question. She wrote, plainly, that Derek had told her he contributed to the mortgage every month, and she wanted to know whether that was true, because if it wasn't, she had some things to reconsider. Derek tried to deflect, saying it was complicated, and that Naomi's version leaves out context. Priya asked what context would explain a bank statement showing 0 contributions over 6 years and a fraudulent loan application with someone else's signature on it. He didn't answer that either. He left the chat 20 minutes later. The group chat reaction wasn't dramatic in a shouting sense. It was quieter than that and honestly more damning. People stopped defending him mid-sentence. Someone asked a follow-up question about the loan application, and Derek left the chat without answering it. Priya messaged me privately, not to attack me, just to ask if the documents I'd sent were real. I told her she was welcome to call the bank directly and verify it herself, which she did. She and Derek were no longer together within the month, though that was her decision, not something I orchestrated or wanted credit for. The partition action moved forward through the court. Because the ownership was joint but the financial contribution was entirely one-sided and documented, and because there was a pending fraud matter attached to his name regarding the property, the judge set a hearing date that would determine either a buyout or a forced sale with proceeds split according to actual financial contribution. As outlined in property law regarding unequal contribution between joint owners, Derek hired a lawyer of his own, a young associate who, from what my attorney later told me, tried to argue that family dynamics and verbal understandings should outweigh the paper trail. The judge was not interested in verbal understandings. 6 years of bank statements, a documented fraud case, and a written admission in a text message left very little room for interpretation. The confrontation that mattered most didn't happen in that kitchen, and it didn't happen in a courtroom either. Not really. It happened in Patricia's office, 3 weeks after the initial letter, in a scheduled mediation meeting meant to see if we could resolve the buyout without a full trial. Derek arrived acting like he still had leverage. He sat down, arms crossed, and opened by saying that this was a family matter and shouldn't have needed lawyers at all, that I was punishing him for one mistake. I let Patricia speak first. She laid out the timeline plainly without embellishment. 6 years of mortgage and expense payments all traceable to my account. 1 loan application, submitted under his access to shared household information, listing my name as co-signer. Without my consent, confirmed fraudulent by the bank's own investigation. A text message dated 8 months prior, in his own words, stating he had no intention of contributing financially to a house he still held equal legal ownership of. Derek. tried to interrupt twice. Patricia didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "We can go through the documentation again if that would help," and continued reading dates and dollar amounts until the room went quiet. At one point, Derek turned to me directly and said this was exactly why he'd never felt like the house was safe for him, that I had always been keeping receipts like I was waiting for a moment to use them against him. I told him calmly that keeping receipts is simply what happens when you pay every bill for 6 years and someone else pays none. I said I hadn't been waiting for a moment. I had been documenting a life, the same way anyone documents anything they're responsible for, and it was only a coincidence of timing that the fraud happened when it did. If it hadn't been the loan application, it would have been something else eventually, because a 6-year pattern like his doesn't stay contained forever. His attorney, the young associate, tried a different angle, suggesting that verbal family agreements about give and take over the years should be weighed against the hard numbers, that Derek had contributed in non-financial ways, helping with occasional errands or being present during our mother's final illness. I didn't dispute that he had been present during that time, and I told the room so, honestly, because I don't believe in erasing the parts of someone that were real. But presence during a family loss and financial responsibility for a shared property are not the same currency, and the court, when it eventually reviewed the case, agreed that they could not be traded against each other dollar for dollar. I spoke. Only once during that meeting. I looked at him and said that I had spent most of my life making room for his comfort at the cost of my own, and that this house, the one thing our father left us to share, had become the last place I was willing to do that. I told him I wasn't asking for revenge. I was asking for what the numbers already said was mine. He didn't have a response to that. He signed the buyout agreement 2 weeks later, after his own attorney advised him that going to trial with an active fraud finding on record would likely cost him more in legal fees and a worse outcome than settling. The buyout amount was calculated, using the equity in the house minus the 6 years of expenses he owed me, which the spreadsheet had already proven in exact figures the court accepted without dispute. He also lost his position at the financial firm 2 months later. It wasn't because of the buyout. It was because an open fraud investigation involving identity misuse, even resolved through family settlement, was enough for a firm handling client funds to quietly let him go during a routine compliance review. I didn't cause that. His own actions did. The paperwork simply made sure no one could pretend otherwise. I changed the locks the day the settlement was finalized. Not out of spite, but because it was, legally and practically, my house now, fully in my name, the way it should have functioned all along given who had actually been holding it up. The day he came to collect his things, it was quiet. No shouting, no scene. He packed 2 boxes and a suitcase into his car. I stood in the doorway, not blocking him, just present, the way you're present at the end of something rather than the middle of a fight. He asked me almost bitterly if I felt good about all this. I told him I didn't feel good. I felt clear. There's a difference. Good implies I enjoyed watching consequences land on someone I grew up loving. Clear means I finally stopped absorbing the cost of someone else's choices. He left without saying much else. I watched his car pull out of the driveway, and then I went back inside and made myself a full plate of food in my own kitchen, in a house that was finally fully mine, and I ate every bite of it slowly without anyone telling me to go easy. The house is quiet now. I still cook in that kitchen most nights. Sometimes I catch myself instinctively serving a smaller portion, an old habit from childhood dinners that I'm still unlearning, and then I stop, and I serve myself the same as anyone else would deserve, because I finally understand that I always did. The locksmith came on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after the settlement was finalized. It took him under 20 minutes to change the front and back deadbolts. I watched him work from the kitchen doorway, holding a mug of coffee, and when he handed me the new set of keys, I remember feeling a strange kind of stillness settle over. Me, not triumph exactly, just the quiet relief of a door that finally only opens for the people I choose to let in. I redid the guest room that used to be Derek's, the one he'd occupied for 6 years. I gave the walls a fresh coat of pale gray paint, replaced the old blinds with curtains that actually let in morning light, and turned it into a small reading room with a second-hand armchair I found at an estate sale. It sounds like a small thing, repainting a room, but it mattered to me. It was the physical proof that a space which had held 6 years of one-sided obligation could become something that simply belonged to me, without conditions attached. Relationship with Linda and Ray actually grew closer after everything settled, not because they took sides dramatically, but because the ordeal forced a kind of honesty into the family that hadn't existed before. Linda told me once, over coffee, that she'd always sensed something was uneven between Derek and me growing up, but never had proof solid enough to say anything. She apologized for not asking harder questions years earlier. I told her she didn't owe me that apology, that the burden of proof had always unfairly rested on me to justify my own frustration, and that was exactly the pattern I was finally done accepting. I heard through mutual family that Derek eventually found work again, at a smaller firm, in a role with less responsibility and lower pay than what he'd had before. I don't take satisfaction in that specifically. I take a quieter kind of peace in knowing that the consequence was proportional, tied directly to actions he chose, actions the paperwork could only reflect, not invent. I think a lot about the difference between revenge and self-respect, because people often confuse the two, and I understand why. Revenge wants someone to hurt as much as you did. Self-respect just wants the truth to be visible and the cost of dishonesty to land where it actually belongs. I never lied about Derek. I never exaggerated a single figure or forged a single document. Everything that happened to him happened because his own actions, laid out plainly in dates and numbers, could not survive daylight. That's not cruelty. That's consequence. I don't know if Derek and I will ever speak again in any meaningful way. Part of me hopes that somewhere down the line he looks at what happened and understands it wasn't about the house at all. It was about 6 years, and honestly closer to 30, of being told to know my place in rooms I was the one holding up. People sometimes ask me if I feel guilty, given that he's my brother, given that we share a childhood and a mother we both loved and lost. I've thought about that question a lot, sitting alone in that quiet kitchen some evenings. Guilt implies I did something to him that he didn't first do to himself. I didn't forge his signature. I didn't tell a bank he was someone he wasn't. I didn't ask him to stop contributing for 6 years while still expecting authority over a house. He no longer functionally supported. Every consequence that landed on him traces back to a choice he made, on a specific date that someone somewhere wrote down. I simply stopped protecting him from the paper trail of his own decisions. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from a boundary built entirely out of proof rather than anger. Anger fades and needs to be refueled constantly to stay convincing. Proof just sits there, quiet and complete, needing nothing from you to remain true. I didn't need to remind myself daily why I was doing what I was doing. I could look at a spreadsheet, a bank letter, a screenshot, and know, without doubt, that I wasn't overreacting to a small thing. I was responding, finally, proportionally, to 6 years of being told my contribution didn't matter as much as his comfort. So here's what I want to ask you, whoever's listening tonight. Have you ever kept the peace so long that you forgot what it felt like to simply be treated fairly? And when you finally stopped, was it anger that got you there? Or was it something quieter, something more like clarity? If this story meant something to you, if any part of it reminded you of your own kitchen table, your own group chat, your own quiet decision to stop absorbing what was never yours to carry, tell me in the comments. I read every one. If you want more stories like this, stories about boundaries built out of evidence instead of shouting, hit subscribe, and give this video a like so it reaches someone else who needs to hear it tonight. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. This story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real individuals, families, or events is purely coincidental and is intended for storytelling and entertainment purposes only.